London, spring of 1765. A debate in Parliament over what seems to be a very small shift in colonial policy. Running the overseas provinces has become extremely expensive. Parliament announces that for the first time, the Americans will pay a small tax, not to their local legislatures, but directly to England.
I think perhaps the first thing that one has to say, looking back on it, seeing now, as we must do, that this was the opening of something which was going to be very big and very important, is that nobody realized that at the time.
It is called the Stamp Act because taxed items will have to carry a stamp, paid for by the user. Test pressings are made, and the new tax is set to go into effect in the fall. It takes 6 weeks by sailing ship for news of the tax to cross the ocean. When it arrives, the news creates a firestorm up and down the continent. For the colonial elite, the men who run the local legislatures, the Stamp Act is an outrage. It seems to confirm their worst suspicions, that they are not respected in England, not worth even being consulted about this change in policy. George Washington is a delegate sitting in the Virginia legislature.
The Stamp Act, imposed on the colonies by the Parliament of Great Britain, is an ill-judged measure. Parliament has no right to put its hands into our pockets without our consent.
Even royal appointees like the highly regarded Thomas Hutchinson, Chief Justice of Massachusetts, are upset.
You must not deprive the colonies of their right to make laws for themselves. Parliament should only make laws necessary for the empire as a whole.
The larger meaning of their life was wrapped up in being Britons. They were proud not to be Dutch, not to be French, not to be Spanish colonists, but to be British colonists, and to have, for 150 years, taxed themselves, governed themselves, behaved just like independent Englishmen did, although they were living in America. Now suddenly the Stamp Act implied that they were going to be governed, taxed by a parliament a long way away in which they had no representatives.
The intimidation of royal officials spreads to other colonies. Would-be stamp distributors are attacked. Stamp paper is seized when it arrives from England. Throughout the colonies, daily battles with the committees are causing royal officials great distress. In Massachusetts, Chief Justice Thomas Hutchinson fears that his beloved province is heading for mob rule. He secretly writes to a friend in the British Parliament that firm measures are needed from England. It is a letter that will come back to haunt him. The letter confirms what the British government is already thinking. Order must be restored in Massachusetts. In what they consider merely a police action, they send a brigade of troops to Boston to quell the rioters and arrest the ringleaders.
Sending troops to Boston is asking for trouble. You are putting young soldiers, who are by nature insolent, in the midst of a people who consider themselves threatened and oppressed. It's like setting up a blacksmith's forge in a magazine of gunpowder.
March 5th, 1770. An angry crowd begins throwing snowballs at British soldiers. The soldiers fire back, and 5 Bostonians are killed. Paul Revere produces a wildly inaccurate illustration of the event. In his version, soldiers are shooting completely innocent civilians. The incident becomes known as the Boston Massacre. It galvanizes people throughout the colonies. In an angry mood, Parliament passes a series of acts designed to restore royal authority in Boston. They install a military governor, General Thomas Gage, and send 2,000 soldiers to back him up. they close the port of Boston. Parliament calls these the coercive acts. The Americans call them the intolerable acts.
If you could close the port of Boston, you could close the port of New York or Philadelphia. If you could undo the Massachusetts Charter, you could undo any of the charters, any of the colonists could have their rights taken away. This was simply intolerable as far as the Americans are concerned, that these coercive acts could apply to them as easily as they had applied to Massachusetts.
Up and down the continent, delegates are chosen for what will become known as the First Continental Congress.
In many ways, the First Continental Congress is a delayed reaction. What do you do when you have to respond to something and you don't know how to respond? You call a committee meeting.
John Dickinson of Philadelphia is in the forefront of the growing protest movement.
I'd be very sorry if we did anything which would justly displease our sovereign. But if your neighbor's house is burning, you wouldn't just fold your hands and watch. Let the colonies unite with one spirit in one cause.
There was no sense, I think, of unity against the British as yet. I think they saw themselves as Englishmen, and for the most part, people from Massachusetts and people from Virginia were more in touch with people in London than they were with each other.
It is not in any way certain how the other colonies will respond to the British occupation of Boston. There is the strong suspicion among some of the delegates that the leaders of Massachusetts are hotheads and troublemakers.
I am discovering that this continent is a vast, unwieldy machine. We are 13 colonies, strangers, largely unacquainted with each other, now rushing together in one great mass. It's not surprising that we are jealous of each other's designs, fearful, timid, skittish.
The Congress debates for 2 months. The delegates agree to fully support Massachusetts. They also pass a resolution that the colonies should arm and prepare to defend themselves, if necessary, against any future British aggression. They send a petition to the king, affirming their loyalty and asking for the end of military rule in Boston.
What happens in 1774 is that 13 clocks suddenly begin to strike as one. That's what John Adams said. That's the most important fact of the First Continental Congress. Up to 1774, you have 13 different movements, very different, independent, but we won't even call them independence movements, we'll call them protest movements to British authority. But in 1774, 13 different countries, that's the way they thought of themselves, suddenly come together and begin to speak, or attempt to speak, with one voice.
Before parting for what they believe will be the last time, the delegates gather at the City Tavern for a final dinner and a toast of loyalty to England.
To His Majesty King George, may the sword of the parent never be stained by the blood of his children.
London, February 1775. Parliament has just received word of Congress's resolution that Americans should arm themselves. They do not see this as a gesture of loyalty. A report is sent to King George.
If the rabble in Boston is committed to open rebellion, then the king's honor and the safety of the empire require that force be met with force. They are a disorganized mob which cannot present a very great opposition to our regular troops. Perhaps it is better to bring on a small conflict now rather than later, when a rebellious spirit has had a chance to ripen. Proper, very proper.
April 19th, 1775. General Gage decides to send 700 soldiers into the countryside to capture a cache of arms. It is to be a minor operation. Their destination? Concord. A Boston silversmith, Paul Revere, and others hear of it and spread the word to the surrounding communities. On Lexington Green, the rebel militia under Captain Parker turns out to meet the British troops.
And the British officers came up and went forward to Parker, and they said, "Disperse, ye rebels." Parker looked at his measly lineup of men versus this royal line with bayonets that were facing him. He turned to his troops and said, "Disperse." And they turned and started to disperse and walk away. And then someone fired the shot.
No one to this day knows who fired the first shot at Lexington, but perhaps a farmer tripped over his musket in retreating. Clearly, the colonials were giving ground. A gun went off, and then the British troops began firing. Their officers lost control of them.
Some of the British line fired, the Americans fired back, men dropped on both sides, and the battle had begun. The Americans ran, the British advanced with a bayonet, and the battle was all over.
No one had given orders for the attack. No one had given orders for the reply. But on this day, on Lexington Green, a political argument among members of the same family has become a blood feud. The British continue on to Concord to complete their work of capturing the store of munitions. By this time, word is out. The British are coming.